Have you ever noticed how quickly conversations among Catholics turn into an us versus them battle, especially when politics are involved? Well, that is because of polarization, and it's tearing our church apart. Today, we're going to talk about why that happens and why it is endangering our unity as Christians. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about politics in this video, which is a controversial and sensitive topic, I know. But I want to make it clear that I'm not taking sides here. And if you stick with me throughout the video, you will see me address both sides of the question. So please bear with me and keep an open mind as we go through this video together. Hello everyone and welcome back. In my last video, we talked about how Pope Francis used the concept of opposizione polare or polar opposition to solve complex theological questions. And I ended that video with a caveat, namely that polar opposition is not the same as polarization. So, if you remember, polar opposition means to hold a tension between two sides and then solving this tension on a higher plane. And that is orthodoxy. Whereas heterodoxy or heresy tries to cut this tension by choosing one side over the other. This means that when the tension is cut, there are going to be people who are going to side with one pole or one side, and people are going to side with the other pole or other side. And since the tension has been cut, there's not going to be any continuity between these two groups of people, nothing that binds them together. When that happens, there's going to be two groups of people settling into two opposite camps, and each side is going to define itself against the other, so that an identity becomes built on that opposition. This is polarization, and as you can see, it's the complete opposite of the concept of polar opposition as Pope Francis defined it. So, if you remember that last video of mine, I mentioned many tensions and explained how orthodoxy sits in the balance between two extremes. And one of the tensions that I mentioned there was the tension between radical liberals or radical progressives on one side and the radical traditionalists and radical conservatives on the other. So the liberals are going to cut this tension and run to the liberal side, whereas the traditionalists and conservatives are going to do the exact same thing but just run to the opposite end. The result of this? Two camps within the church that can't see eye to eye and that are always fighting each other. Radical liberals on one side and radical traditionalists and conservatives on the other. And this is a problem. The church should not be this collection of competing parties always battling for her soul. Rather, the church should be united. Catholics should be united amongst themselves and most especially with the Pope and the bishops in communion with him, because the Pope is the guarantor of unity. There should not be, liberal Catholics or progressive Catholics. There should not be conservative Catholics or traditionalist Catholics. There should be only Catholics who have one leaning or the other. But there's no need for extra labels or prefixes to be added to the word Catholic. When there is polarization, each camp is going to judge everything according to its own group's internal logic. So, for example, The traditionalists are going to judge the liberals for not meeting their own traditionalist standards. But then the traditionalists are going to also judge the centrists for the same thing. And then they're going to lump the centrists with the liberals. And most grievously, the traditionalists are going to judge the entire church for not meeting the standard of their own tribe. And if the church dares to take even the slightest step in the other direction to try to resolve the tensions as it should, then it will be interpreted as the whole church having gone liberal, and that must be resisted at all costs, even by inciting rebellion against the Pope and the living magisterium. And that's why both Pope Francis and synodality came under fire. Neither Pope Francis was a liberal, nor synodality was a secret plot to liberalize the church. No. But since it seemed liberal to them, and since it gave a platform for the liberals to express themselves, then it should be viewed as a threat, as coming from the other side. For these traditionalists and conservative Catholics, they are the only faithful Catholics, and only they should have the ear both of the Pope or of the synodal process. By the way, I already addressed this logic in my reply to an article from Dr. Jeff Myris, which I made into a video. And I also made another video about how this label of faithful Catholics is wrong and dangerous. I will leave a link to both videos in the description below. And this is why this factionalism is so dangerous. Once there are parties within the church that judge the entire church according to the internal logic of that party, then that party is the one that becomes the reference, not the church. And before long, this party starts to matter more than the whole church. The entire church only matters insofar as it can be potentially transformed into the image and likeness of that internal party, so that the objective is that the party will absorb the entire church. And just to be clear, until now I've used the traditionalist camp as an illustration of what I'm saying. But everything that I said before can be applied just as equally to the liberal camp. Now, it is important to know what the root cause of this polarization is. This political polarization within the church did not come from a vacuum. It did not grow naturally and organically from within the church. Rather, it was imported into the church by the outside world, where political polarizations have been growing sharper and sharper. And to be clear, not every Catholic in these factions lines up perfectly with those political parties from without. But if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it is undeniable that the political polarization in the secular world has been shaping what's going on within the church today. I remember this starting to take shape during the Obama years. At that time, many Catholics started drifting towards certain positions like pro choice or pro euthanasia or pro LGBTQ advocacy. And many Catholics recognized that these stances were not compatible with Catholic teaching, and they were right. So they held firm to their pro-life and pro-family positions, which are the Catholic positions. And since the Republican Party also championed those positions, many of these Catholics started flocking to that party as a way to oppose the progressive wave. But the problem is that when they did so, they stopped identifying as mere Catholics who happened to agree with the Republican Party on some issues to begin to identify as conservative Catholics whose identity was tied to that political party itself. That's when the polarization process was completed. But just because it was completed, it did not mean that it could not aggravate, and in fact, it has only worsened since then. From the correct assumption that the Republican Party was right in its pro life and pro family position and that it had to be defended on those areas, they went to think that the Republican Party should, be defended in everything it did, lest by weakening the Republican Party, the Democratic Party could be strengthened on their pro choice and pro euthanasia positions. And from then on, the whole church was to be judged according to the Republican Party's platform. And every single tenet from the Republican Party line had to be compatible with the Catholic faith, even when it was not. So, if the Republicans supported the death penalty, whereas the church advocated for the worldwide abolition of the death penalty, going so far as to deem it inadmissible, then the Republicans were the ones who were right. They were the ones who were defending tradition, and the bishops and the popes were the ones who were betraying the faith. If the Republicans embraced a xenophobic stance, turning immigrants into scapegoats for every societal ill, or directing social hostility towards, brothers and sisters who are only trying to get better lives for themselves and their families, well, then the Republicans were right in doing that, and the church was wrong by opposing that because then the church would be liberal. We have gone to such an extreme in that regard that when Republicans cut the funding for church programs that aid immigrants, and that looks bad, that's bad optics, so the Republicans started to promote propaganda saying that the church was being corrupt when receiving funding for those programs. Well, those Catholics just accepted that propaganda without question and again sided with the party over the church. Just go to any social media where there's a sharing of a statement from the USCCB or a pope that does not align with the Republican Party on any topic. Healthcare, gun control, racism, anthropogenic climate change, or the economy, you'll see lots of people accusing the Pope and the bishops of being liberals that are betraying the faith. And this is a sign of polarization. And they will also argue that the church should not delve so much into politics, that the role of the church is to address spiritual matters and the salvation of souls. Like Jesus Christ did not tie the salvation of souls to feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the prisoner, and so on. But when we are dealing with the pro-life and pro-family positions, then suddenly the church is not involved enough in politics and should do more on that area. And this double standard, again, is a sign of polarization because there's no consistency of principles or actions. Things are only right or wrong according to whether they make one political party look good or not. They even built rationalizations in which their topics of preference, the pro life and pro family topics, are deemed non negotiable, which implies that all the other issues, like the death penalty or immigration reform, are negotiables. And conveniently, all the negotiable issues are the ones that do not align with the Republican Party agenda. All of this is polarization, and there's even a darker side to it, believe it or not, which is when people just do things to provoke the other side. In this instance, to own the libs. So they are going to start performing acts just to own the libs, like openly racist comments or embracing actual fascist ideology, even doing Nazi salutes. Hopefully, we are still at a point when we can agree that that is self evidently wrong. And this sparks a reaction from the other side. Since the pro life movement has for so many years aligned with these bad political decisions in other topics, now there are many liberals who are proposing that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, pun intended. These liberals are basically saying that we should stop advocating for pro life laws that would codify the basic human rights of the unborn into the law, basically leaving the unborn children as the only marginalized group that should not have legal protection of its most basic human rights, like the right to life. But if you ask those liberals if they would be okay with that being the case for any other marginalized group, like the poor, the sick, the immigrants, the minorities, they will say that no, the human rights of those groups should not be left to the whims of those who might infringe upon them, and rightly so. Again, this inconsistency is a sign of polarization. Once more, it's not about consistently applying principles or actions. It's about benefiting the narrative of one political party over the other. And that's why, again, if you go to social media, wherever a USCCB statement or a Pope statement says anything about being pro life or anything that does not align with the Democrat Party, there's going to be many people saying that the bishops and the popes are a bunch of conservatives, likely sometimes side by side with the ones that say that they're a bunch of liberals. But if those liberals say we should not pass pro life laws, then what should we do? Well, they say that we should work in improving the socioeconomic conditions that pressure women into choosing a. And let me be clear, that is very good. We should strive precisely to reduce those pressures, no doubt about it. But here's the thing, those policies were something that the Democrat Party was already planning on implementing, regardless of its effect on the unborn. But we don't need to choose. We can strive to improve the socioeconomic conditions of the pregnant women, and we can prohibit the act itself so that it is no longer framed as an acceptable solution or even as if it were a human right. Again, as Orthodox Catholics, we are called to hold attention. Yes, we can protect the unborn through the law. Yes, we can help the women through socioeconomic means, through social justice and welfare. And we can do both at the same time. And we can and should hold the tension in other areas as well. Yes, you can oppose gender ideology, but you can at the same time treat LGBTQ people with dignity and respect. Yes, you can oppose the dehumanization of the unborn, but also of the immigrant. Yes, you can oppose euthanasia, but also the death penalty at the same time. And there's only two things stopping you from choosing both. One, secular political parties completely extraneous to the church telling you that you have to perfectly align with their agenda, and two, you believing them. And this brings me to another danger of this polarization within the church. So, as I said before, one of the things that happens is that intra ecclesial political parties start to judge the entire church according to the internal logic of that political party. And in the case of political polarization, this internal logic is ideology. And this is a problem because then ideology starts replacing the faith as the framework we use to understand reality. And this is a problem because ideology, unlike the faith, is a poor guide to reality. Now, the faith, the orthodoxy, as I said, is able to hold the tension between two statements. So it is better equipped to deal with the complexity and messiness of reality. Ideologies, on the other hand, are too simplistic. They always view the problems the same way and they always offer the same solutions. They are like a hammer that sees every issue as a nail. And it's precisely because they are so simplistic that ideologies are so appealing. They are very easy to understand and very easy to apply. They remove the hard work of thinking critically about every single situation. So, when faced with a problem, the liberal will immediately say that the state should step in without any regards for the principle of subsidiarity. Whereas the conservative is going to look at the exact same problem and say that the state should stop butting in and leave everything up to private charities, regardless of whether those charities have the reach or the resources to effectively solve the problem. So, even before the details of the problem are fully known, the liberals are already saying, oh, we need more state, more state. Whereas the conservative is saying, oh, we need less state, because the point is not about solving the problem. The point is about making the state bigger or smaller. That is the concern, not solving the problem. A mature Catholic knows that the point should be finding ethical and effective answers to the problem. So sometimes the state will need to step in. Sometimes private organizations should take the lead. Sometimes the state and those private organizations will need to coordinate their efforts because it's not about the state. It's not about the private organizations. It's about the people who need their problems solved. In short, a mature Catholic exercises discernment. And that's why so many people took issue with Pope Francis's emphasis on discernment, because it challenged their simplistic worldviews and forced them to face reality in an adult way. But since these people were so ideologized, they saw Pope Francis's emphasis on discernment as a plot to liberalize the church. Why? Because it got in the way of their ideology. And so, in an us versus them mentality, it was not something that came from us, so it must come from them. So, if it comes from them, it must be bad. And if it is bad, it must be liberal. This too is polarization. And until now, I've mentioned how these American secular political parties have polarized American society. But since the US is at the moment a major exporter of culture worldwide, then this polarization was exported beyond its borders to the rest of the world and even, unfortunately, into the church herself. And that's why Pope Francis was so keen in advancing antidotes to this polarization. And one of those is precisely synodality, because synodality challenges us to go beyond the confines of our tribe and to journey together as a universal church with the Pope and under the Pope. And it requires us to listen to everyone, even those that traditionally did not have the ear of the church. And no, synodality was not a plot to liberalize the church, and the conservatives were not sidelined during the synodal process. I debunk both of those myths in my video on synodality, which I will also link in the description below. But it's not just synodality. The totality of Pope Francis's theology was a way to counter this polarization. So, for instance, again, the concept of opposizione polare, in which two statements are held in tension and the tension is solved on a higher plane. This, too, as my whole video was intended to show, was a way to counter polarization. And in my last video, I illustrated this by taking recourse to one of Pope Francis's principles in Evangelii Gaudium, which is unity prevails over conflict. But here today, I want to leave you with another principle from Evangelii Gaudium. The whole is greater than the parts. We are Catholics. Catholic means universal. So we have to have this universality and place it above all tribes and parties. We cannot judge the Catholic Church based on its parts, because the whole is greater than the parts. And in fact, the whole is even greater than the sum of all the parts. Being a Catholic is bigger than being a liberal or a conservative, a traditionalist or a progressive. So let's transcend these labels and rise up above this us versus them mentality that is polarizing our church. As Pope Francis urged us to do so often, and in the spirit of Pope Leo XIV's calls for unity, let's stop building walls and start building bridges. Stop creating walls that separate your tribe from the others. Instead, let's build bridges that keep this continuity between both sides alive and thus strengthening the church in the unity that it creates. And for the record, it's not just Pope Francis that is an antidote to this polarization. I would like today to recommend my book, The Unknown Modern Side of St. Pius X. And in chapters 4 and 6 of this book, I talk about how Pope St. Pius X abhorred the intra-ecclesial political polarizations of his time and was constantly urging the Catholics to remain united with each other and with the Pope. I leave a link where you can buy this book in the video description below, as well as links to all the other videos of mine that I mentioned throughout this video, as well as a link to my personal website, pedrogabrielwriter.com, where you can learn more about my books and projects. Also, if you like this video, please like and subscribe so that you will always be updated when a new video is uploaded. That's all for today. God bless, end the polarization, and see you soon.